The Zephyrians were once the most beautiful beings in the galaxy. Picture creatures made of living crystal, their bodies clear as glass but filled with swirling colors that danced and moved with every emotion. When they were happy, golden light would spiral through their forms like warm honey. When they felt sad, deep blue waves would flow from head to toe. They didn't speak with words like we do. Instead, they talked by flashing different colored lights through their crystal bodies, creating conversations that looked like the most amazing light shows you could imagine. Their home planet, Ethros, was absolutely stunning. Entire cities were built from the same crystal material as their bodies, reaching high into the sky like frozen rainbows. The buildings would glow and pulse with the thoughts and feelings of everyone living inside them. At night, the whole planet would shimmer, with millions of lights as the Zephyrians went about their daily lives. Other alien races would travel from across the galaxy just to see this incredible sight. The Zephyrians weren't just pretty to look at, though. They were incredibly smart, especially when it came to math and creating beautiful art. They could solve mathematical problems that would take our best computers years to figure out, and they did it just by thinking. Their artists would create sculptures and paintings using light itself, making masterpieces that existed only as beams of colored energy floating in the air. Universities throughout the galaxy would send their brightest students to learn from Zephyrian teachers. For thousands of years, everything was perfect on Ethros. The Zephyrians lived peaceful, happy lives, sharing their knowledge with other alien species and helping to make the galaxy a better place. They had trade agreements with dozens of different worlds, selling their mathematical discoveries and buying resources they needed. Their crystal cities grew larger and more beautiful with each passing century. Then disaster struck without any warning. It started small, with just a few Zephyrians in one city noticing something strange. The bright, clear crystal of their bodies began to turn cloudy and dull. Instead of the beautiful flowing colors that usually dance through them, there were only ugly dark patches spreading like ink stains. At first, everyone thought it was just a minor illness that would go away on its own. But it didn't go away. Within days, the sickness had spread to hundreds of Zephyrians in that city. The dark patches grew larger, and the crystal of their bodies became rough and cracked. Worse still, they couldn't communicate properly anymore. The light speech that had connected their entire civilization for millennia began to fail as their bodies lost the ability to create and control colored light. The disease, which came to be known as the Crimson Plague because of the red tinge it gave to infected crystal, spread faster than anyone could have imagined. It moved through their light-based communication networks like a computer virus, jumping from one Zephyrian to another every time they tried to talk. Within weeks, entire cities were infected. The beautiful glowing metropolises of Ethros began to dim as millions of Zephyrians lost their ability to create light. Scientists from all over the galaxy rushed to help, but nothing they tried worked. The disease was unlike anything anyone had ever seen before. Traditional medicines had no effect, and even the most advanced alien technologies couldn't slow its spread. As months passed, the situation grew more and more desperate. Zephyrian bodies weren't just losing their light, they were becoming brittle and weak. Many began to crack and break apart, and their population started dropping rapidly. The other alien civilizations grew scared. They had never seen a disease spread so quickly or cause such terrible damage. Worried that the plague might somehow jump to their own species, they made the hardest decision in galactic history. The Great Andromeda Trade Consortium, which had included hundreds of different alien races working together for thousands of years, voted to completely cut off all contact with the Zephyrian home system. Massive space stations were built at every entrance to Zephyrian space, armed with powerful weapons to turn away any ship that tried to get through. Supply convoys that had been bringing food and materials to Ethros for centuries were redirected to other worlds. Even the hyperspace highways that connected different star systems were blocked off, making it impossible for anyone to travel to or from the Zephyrian homeworld. Most heartbreaking of all, even the Zephyrians' oldest and closest friends abandoned them. The Virians, an alien race that could feel and share emotions across great distances, had been allies with the Zephyrians for over 10,000 years. But even they sealed their borders and refused to answer desperate calls for help, too afraid that the mysterious plague might somehow affect them too. From their dying world, the few remaining healthy Zephyrians sent out message after message, begging for assistance. They broadcast their pleas across the galaxy, asking for medicine, for food, for any kind of help at all. But the messages went unanswered. One by one, the great crystal cities of Ethros went dark as their populations dwindled from billions to millions, then from millions to just thousands of survivors struggling to stay alive on a world that was slowly becoming a tomb. Captain J. Lee sat in the command chair of his ship, the Defiant Hope, staring at the weak signal coming through his communications array. Most captains would have dismissed it as space static, but Lee had always been different. While other officers followed rules and procedures to the letter, he trusted his gut feelings and wasn't afraid to take risks when lives were on the line. This attitude had gotten him in trouble with Terran Fleet Command more times than he could. Humans were still the new kids on the block in galactic society. It had only been 50 years since we first made contact with alien civilizations, and most of them still looked down on us as wild, unpredictable creatures who didn't understand how the galaxy really worked. They called us primitive behind our backs and rolled their eyes when human representatives spoke at galactic meetings. We were tolerated members of the galactic community, but barely. The other alien races had been traveling between stars for thousands of years before humans even figured out how to leave Earth. They had established trade routes, political systems, and social customs that were older than human civilization itself. To them, we were like children who had just learned to walk, stumbling around and breaking things without understanding the consequences. But that reputation for being reckless and unpredictable was exactly what made Captain Lee perfect for what happened next. As he listened to that faint signal, he realized it wasn't random noise at all. Hidden in the static were desperate voices speaking in the light language of the Zephyrians, calling out for help that would never come. The quarantine barriers were designed to keep everything in, but tiny bits of their communications were still leaking through the cracks. Lee called his communications officer, Lieutenant Park, over to his station. "Are you hearing what I'm hearing?" he asked, pointing at the readout showing the signal patterns. Park nodded grimly. They both knew what this meant. Somewhere in that sealed-off star system, people were dying, and no one in the galaxy was willing to help them. Every regulation in the book told Lee to ignore the signals and continue with his patrol mission. The quarantine of the Zephyrian system wasn't just a suggestion, it was galactic law enforced by multiple alien governments. Any ship that tried to enter that space would be fired upon without warning. Even if he somehow made it through the blockade, he would be court-martialed when he returned and probably spend the rest of his life in prison. But Lee couldn't stop thinking about those voices calling out in the darkness. He imagined what it would be like if Earth was quarantined and humans were left to die while the rest of the galaxy turned their backs on us. The thought made his stomach turn. He called a meeting with his senior officers to discuss the situation. Commander Kim, his second-in-command, was against the idea from the start. "Sir, this is suicide," she said. "Even if we could somehow get past the blockade ships, we don't know anything about this plague. We could all get infected and die horrible deaths." The ship's doctor, Lieutenant Choi, agreed with her. "We're not equipped to deal with alien diseases. We barely understand Zephyrian biology in the first place." But Lee had made up his mind. 50 years ago, when humans first reached for the stars, we promised ourselves we would never forget what it was like to be alone and afraid, he said. "Those people are calling for help and everyone else has abandoned them. If we don't go, no one will." The argument went on for hours, but eventually Lee pulled rank and ordered the ship to change course. Word spread quickly through the ship's corridors. Some crew members were terrified, others were angry, but many were proud to serve under a captain who would risk everything to save strangers. The Defiant Hope wasn't traveling alone either. 3 other human ships had also picked up the distress signals, and their captains made the same dangerous choice. The journey to the Zephyrian system took 2 weeks, and every day the signals grew stronger and more desperate. By the time they reached the quarantine barrier, the human crews could clearly hear individual Zephyrian voices pleading for medicine, for food, for someone to acknowledge that they still existed. The blockade ships tried to turn them away, But the human captains had come too far to give up now. Using tactics that other species considered crazy and unpredictable, the human ships managed to slip through the defenses. What they found when they reached Ethros broke their hearts. The beautiful crystal cities that had once lit up the entire planet were now dark and crumbling. Massive towers that had stood for thousands of years lay in pieces on the ground. The few Zephyrians they could see moving through the ruins looked nothing like the magnificent creatures from the history books. These survivors were dull and gray, their crystal bodies cracked and brittle. They moved slowly and carefully, as if they might shatter at any moment. When they tried to communicate using their traditional light speech, only weak, flickering glows emerged from their damaged forms. Many could barely make any light at all. Most alien species would have taken one look at this scene and fled in terror. The smart thing to do would have been to turn around immediately and report back to their governments. But humans had something that set us apart from every other species in the galaxy. We had survived our own plagues and disasters throughout history, and we understood that sometimes the only way to survive is to help each other, no matter how dangerous it might be. Captain Lee opened communications with the surviving Zephyrians and spoke the words that would change everything. "This is the human ship, Defiant Hope. We're here to help." Dr. Soo Kim had always been the kind of doctor who thought outside the box. While other medical officers relied on fancy alien technology and established procedures, she preferred to understand how things actually worked at the most basic level. When the human fleet arrived at Ethros and saw the suffering Zephyrians, Kim immediately got to work studying this mysterious plague that had stumped the galaxy's best scientists. Setting up a makeshift medical lab in the cargo bay of the Defiant Hope, Kim began examining samples of infected Zephyrian crystal tissue. What she found was unlike anything in human medical textbooks. The Crimson Plague wasn't a normal virus or bacteria that attacked cells and organs like diseases that humans were familiar with. Instead, it was something far more strange and complex. The plague existed at the quantum level, the tiny invisible world where the basic building blocks of reality operate according to rules that seem to make no sense. It was attacking the very structure that held the Zephyrians' crystal bodies together, breaking down the special bonds between atoms that gave them their beautiful transparent appearance and their ability to create light. Other alien species had tried to fight the plague using their most advanced medical equipment. The highly evolved Altarians had brought machines that could manipulate individual molecules. The ancient Centaurians had used energy weapons designed to target specific types of infections, but all of their sophisticated technology was too specialized, too precise for this weird quantum enemy that seemed to shift and change every time they tried to pin it down. Dr. Kim realized that human medicine's biggest weakness might actually be its greatest strength in this situation. Human medical technology was primitive compared to what other species had developed over thousands of years. Our equipment was crude, our techniques were simple, and our understanding of advanced alien biology was limited. But that also meant our approach was flexible and adaptable in ways that the other species' perfect, specialized tools were not. Working with her small team of human medics, Kim started experimenting with treatments that combined basic human antiviral drugs with jury-rigged quantum stabilizers built from spare parts around the ship. It was like trying to perform brain surgery with kitchen utensils. But somehow the rough, improvised approach began to show promise where elegant alien solutions had failed. The real breakthrough came when Kim was studying brain scans of her own crew members. She noticed something fascinating about human neural patterns compared to other species. While most alien races had very orderly, predictable thought processes that followed logical patterns, human brains were chaotic and unpredictable. Our thoughts jumped around randomly, made weird connections, and followed paths that seemed to make no sense to other species. This mental chaos that other aliens saw as a sign of human primitiveness turned out to be exactly what was needed to fight the quantum plague. The disease spread by following certain quantum patterns and frequencies like a computer virus that moved through predictable pathways in a network. But human brain patterns were so random and chaotic that they could actually disrupt and scramble the plague's quantum signature. Kim proposed an incredibly dangerous experiment. If human volunteers could somehow broadcast their chaotic neural patterns directly into the infected Zephyrians' crystal matrix, it might be possible to confuse the plague enough to stop its spread, and maybe even reverse some of the damage it had caused. The first volunteer was Lieutenant Park from the Communications Department. He had been listening to the Zephyrian distress calls for weeks and couldn't stand the thought of not trying everything possible to help them. Kim attached experimental neural amplifiers to his head, devices that had been cobbled together from the ship's communications equipment and some medical scanners. The procedure was terrifying to watch. Park had to sit perfectly still while powerful electrical currents flowed through his brain, amplifying his thoughts and broadcasting them as quantum energy fields. The neural feedback was intense and painful. Within minutes, Park was sweating and shaking from the strain on his nervous system. But incredibly, the Zephyrian test subject in the next room began to show signs of improvement. The dull gray areas of his crystal body started to clear up and faint glimmers of colored light began to appear. More volunteers stepped forward despite seeing what Park had gone through. Engineer Choi volunteered next, followed by dozens of other crew members from all 4 human ships. Each session was dangerous and exhausting. Some volunteers suffered severe headaches that lasted for days. Others experienced memory problems or difficulty concentrating. A few even suffered permanent damage to their nervous systems, losing the ability to speak clearly or control their movements properly. But they kept going. That's what humans do when people are in trouble. We don't calculate the odds or worry about personal safety. We see someone who needs help, and we help them, even if it means risking everything we have. As more humans underwent the experimental procedures, the effects became stronger and more widespread. The quantum disruption fields they generated began to spread through the Zephyrian crystal cities like healing waves, slowly pushing back the plague that had been destroying their civilization for years. Zephyrians who hadn't been able to create light in months suddenly began to glow again. Others found their cracked and brittle bodies becoming clear and strong once more. Word of the miraculous recovery spread quickly among the surviving Zephyrians. For the first time in years, there was hope on the planet Ethros. The news hit the galactic communication networks like a massive explosion. Within hours of the first reports, every major alien government knew that humans had broken the quarantine around the Zephyrian system. The reaction was swift and absolutely furious. Emergency sessions were called in the Galactic Council, and angry representatives from dozens of species demanded immediate action against Earth. The Andromeda Trade Consortium, which controlled most of the galaxy's commerce, was the first to respond. Their spokesperson, a tall, elegant alien with multiple arms and a voice like grinding metal, appeared on every news channel across known space. The humans have shown a complete disregard for basic safety protocols that have protected our civilizations for millennia, the spokesperson announced. Their reckless actions have put every living being in the galaxy at risk of contamination. The hegemony of worlds, a military alliance that kept peace between different star systems, was even more harsh in their response. Their war council met in an emergency session and voted unanimously to impose severe sanctions on all human territories. Trade routes that had taken decades to establish were immediately shut down. Human merchant ships found themselves banned from alien ports, their cargo holds full of goods they could no longer sell. But it got worse. The Vorthan Empire, known for their strict adherence to rules and regulations, demanded that humans be completely expelled from all galactic institutions. These primitive mammals clearly lack the mental capacity to understand the consequences of their actions, declared the Vorthan ambassador. They are a danger to civilized society and should be treated as such. One by one, alien species that had once welcomed human contact began closing their borders. The Crystalline Coalition recalled their ambassadors from Earth. The Nebula Federation canceled scientific exchange programs that had been running for years. Even species that humans had considered friendly allies started treating human diplomats with cold suspicion and barely concealed disgust. On Earth, the situation became a political nightmare. The world government found itself under enormous pressure from every direction. Galactic representatives demanded that Captain Lee and his crew be arrested and handed over for trial. Economics. Advisors warned that the sanctions could destroy human civilization, cutting us off from the advanced technologies and resources we had come to depend on. President Chen called an emergency meeting with the Global Defense Council. The room was filled with angry voices and worried faces. "We have to do something," insisted the Secretary of Trade. "Our colonies are already running short on medical supplies. If this continues, people will start dying." The military advisors were equally concerned. "Without access to alien technology, our defense systems will be obsolete within a year. We'll be completely vulnerable." Under this immense pressure, the Earth government made a decision that would haunt humanity for years to come. They officially condemned Captain Lee's actions and declared him and his crew to be criminals acting without authorization. Arrest warrants were issued, and human patrol ships were ordered to capture the Defiant Hope and bring the crew back to Earth for prosecution. But Lee and his people had no intention of abandoning their mission. They had seen the suffering on Ethros with their own eyes, and they knew that stopping now would mean the death of an entire civilization. "Let them call us criminals," Lee told his crew during a ship-wide meeting. "History will judge who was right and who was wrong." The captain's words spread throughout the human fleet, and not a single person asked to be transferred away from the mission. Instead, something incredible began to happen. Despite the blockade around the Zephyrian system, more human ships began arriving every week. These weren't official military vessels, but civilian craft piloted by volunteers who had heard about what was happening and decided they couldn't stand by and do nothing. Engineer Dong Park arrived in a converted cargo hauler filled with medical supplies he had bought with his life savings. Navigator Min Choi came in a small scout ship, claiming she had gotten lost during a routine patrol and accidentally ended up in forbidden space. Dr. Yoon brought an entire mobile hospital unit that she had somehow acquired from a decommissioned military base. Each new arrival was taking an enormous personal risk. These volunteers knew they were throwing away their careers, their reputations, and possibly their freedom by joining the relief effort. Many of them had families back on Earth who begged them not to go, but they came anyway because they couldn't live with themselves knowing they had turned their backs on people who needed help. The alien blockade forces were confused and frustrated by this steady stream of human ships. Every time they captured one vessel, two more would appear from different directions. It was like trying to stop water from flowing through their fingers. The humans were using tactics that made no sense to other species, taking incredible risks and making sacrifices that seemed completely irrational. On Ethros, the surviving Zephyrians watched all of this unfold with growing amazement. They could monitor galactic communications and knew exactly what the humans were giving up to help them. These strange mammals were sacrificing their standing in galactic society, their economic prosperity, and their personal safety for a species they had never even met before arriving at the dying planet. As more Zephyrians recovered their ability to create light speech, they began sharing stories about human behavior that seemed impossible to believe. They told of humans who worked 18-hour shifts treating the sick, then volunteered for dangerous experimental procedures during their rest periods. They spoke of human engineers who rebuilt Zephyrian medical facilities using nothing but spare parts and determination. Most incredible of all, they described humans who smiled and joked even while suffering from the painful side effects of the neural broadcast treatments. The galaxy had always viewed humans as primitive and unpredictable, but the Zephyrians were beginning to understand that these qualities weren't weaknesses at all. In a universe where every other species calculated risks and followed procedures, humans were the only ones crazy enough to risk everything for strangers, the only ones stubborn enough to keep fighting when all logic said they should give up. Morning, when Dr. Kim announced that the last traces of the Crimson Plague had been eliminated from Ethros, was a day that nobody who witnessed it would ever forget. After 2 long years of dangerous treatments, experimental procedures, and countless hours of human volunteers risking their lives, the impossible had finally happened. The quantum virus that had nearly destroyed an entire civilization was completely gone. Standing in the main medical facility that humans had built from scratch using salvaged materials and pure determination, Dr. Kim looked at the final test results with tears in her eyes. Every single Zephyrian they had tested showed no signs of infection. The plague that had stumped the galaxy's greatest scientists for years had been defeated by a small group of humans who refused to give up when everyone else had walked away. The transformation of Ethros over those 2 years had been absolutely incredible to witness. When the humans first arrived, They had found a dying world full of crumbling crystal cities and gray, lifeless Zephyrians shuffling through the ruins of their once great civilization. Now, as more and more Zephyrians recovered their health and their ability to create light, the planet was coming back to life in ways that exceeded even their ancient glory. The rebuilt cities were a unique blend of human engineering techniques and traditional Zephyrian crystal architecture. Human engineers like Dong Park had worked alongside recovering Zephyrian builders to create structures that were both practical and beautiful. These new buildings were stronger than the originals, designed to withstand disasters and equipped with backup systems that would prevent another plague from ever spreading so quickly again. But the real magic happened when the Zephyrians began to glow again. As their crystal bodies healed and their ability to create colored light returned, the cities of Ethros started shining brighter than they ever had before. It was as if the near-death experience had somehow enhanced their natural abilities. The light songs they created were more complex and beautiful, telling stories not just of their own recovery, but of the humans who had made it possible. During their recovery period, the Zephyrians had plenty of time to think and work on mathematical problems that had puzzled them for centuries. The combination of their renewed health and the inspiration they drew from human determination led to incredible breakthroughs. They developed new mathematical theorems that completely revolutionized faster-than-light travel, making it possible for ships to cross the galaxy in weeks instead of months. These discoveries didn't just benefit the Zephyrians. The new travel methods made the entire galaxy more connected, allowing trade and communication between distant worlds that had previously been too far apart to interact regularly. It was a gift to the entire galactic community, and everyone knew it had only been possible because humans had saved the Zephyrian civilization from extinction. Meanwhile, the rest of the galaxy had been watching and waiting to see what would happen. Many alien governments had expected the human intervention to end in disaster, with the plague spreading to human ships and potentially escaping the quarantine zone entirely. When that didn't happen, they assumed that the humans would eventually give up and leave the Zephyrians to their fate like everyone else had done. As news spread that the Crimson Plague had been completely eliminated, representatives from various alien governments began making plans to return to the Ethros system. They expected to find grateful Zephyrians who would thank them for their wise decision to maintain the quarantine and prevent the plague from spreading. They thought the Zephyrians would understand that the isolation had been necessary for the greater good of galactic civilization. They could not have been more wrong about what they would find. When the first official alien delegation arrived at Ethros, they were greeted not with gratitude for the quarantine, but with the most beautiful and complex light songs the galaxy had ever witnessed. These weren't just artistic displays, they were detailed stories about human courage, sacrifice, and compassion. The Zephyrians had spent months creating these light symphonies that told the tale of every human who had risked their life to save a dying world. The songs spoke of Captain J. Lee, who had disobeyed direct orders and led his ship into forbidden space because he couldn't ignore calls for help. They told of Dr. Soo Kim, who had worked day and night to understand an alien disease and develop treatments that saved millions of lives. They described human volunteers who had undergone painful and dangerous procedures, knowing they might suffer permanent damage, just to help strangers from another world. The alien delegates listened to these light songs with growing embarrassment and shame. They had expected to be welcomed as heroes for maintaining galactic safety, but instead they were hearing detailed accounts of their own cowardice and abandonment. The Zephyrians made it clear that they understood exactly who had helped them and who had turned their backs when help was needed most. The political consequences were immediate and dramatic. The Zephyrians had always been respected throughout the galaxy for their intelligence and wisdom, and their influence in galactic politics was considerable. When they began using that influence to advocate for humanity, everything changed almost overnight. Within months, the sanctions against human worlds were lifted. Trade agreements that had been cancelled were not only restored, but expanded. The Zephyrians made it clear that any species that wanted to do business with them would also need to treat humans with respect and dignity. More importantly, humanity's status in galactic civilization was completely transformed. Instead of being Seen as primitive newcomers who were barely tolerated, humans were suddenly recognized as full partners in galactic society. Other species began to realize that maybe there was something valuable about human unpredictability and willingness to take risks that other species wouldn't even consider. The galaxy had always prided itself on logic, careful planning, and following established procedures. But the rescue of the Zephyrians proved that sometimes the most logical thing to do is to ignore logic entirely. Sometimes you need a species that's crazy enough to run toward danger when everyone else is running away, stubborn enough to keep fighting when all hope seems lost, and compassionate enough to risk everything for strangers they've never met. Captain Lee, who had been branded a criminal by his own government just 2 years earlier, found himself invited to speak at the Galactic Council. Dr. Kim received the highest honors that alien medical societies could bestow. The human volunteers who had risked their lives were celebrated as heroes throughout known space. But perhaps the most important change was in how other species viewed humanity itself. We were no longer the primitive, reckless species that needed to be watched and controlled. We had become the galaxy's conscience, the ones who would do the right thing even when it was dangerous, expensive, or politically inconvenient. The light had returned to Ethros, and with it, humanity had found its true place among the stars.